Hey, this is Tom, and I know it's tough to imagine, but the war in Ukraine has been going on for 6 months. And while heavy fighting continues in East Ukraine, there's a whole other warfare going on right now between Russia, US, and Europe. This is an all-out economic warfare. And yes, even though there are no actual gunshots being fired as part of this war, much like any other war, the results here are going to be nothing less than catastrophic for all parties involved. Now look, I know absolutely nothing about military strategy, tanks, machine guns, rockets, all that stuff. I can't comment on the physical battlefield. I know jack shit about it. However, I know finance, economics, and I can actually offer you an objective view on who's actually losing this economic warfare. So let's talk about this economic attrition war. Both parties will tell you they don't feel the pain, like two boxers in the ring. But the truth is much more nuanced than that, trust me. So we know that the US has horrible inflation, the worst in 40 years, 9.1% inflation. That's no joking matter. But what about Russia? Well, Russia's official inflation rate just climbed to 16%, and that's for June. Now, that's significantly higher than the US, so this round definitely goes to the US. Let's do round number 2, GDP growth. So the gross domestic product, just to explain, is the total value of all goods and services produced within the country's border in a specific year. And let's start with Russia in this round. Now, Russia's own central bank says its GDP will shrink by 10% this year, while the Institute of International Finance actually says it's probably closer to 15%. So anywhere from 10 to 15% negative decline in 2022 for Russia. However, what about the US? It can be good. Well, it's not amazing. I'm going to be honest with you. In fact, in June, the International Monetary Fund actually reduced US GDP growth forecast for 2.9% for the year, which is a big drop-off from just April, where the number was 3.7%. Now, both numbers are not something to write home about. But while the US is actually still growing, Russia is shrinking by 10 to 15%. So this round has to go to the US as well. Now let's talk about currency, round 3. So the US versus Ruble was actually 75-1 before February 2022 when Russia actually invaded Ukraine. And while it didn't turn into Ruble, like some politicians suggested, it actually didn't soar like an eagle like others may have hoped for. The current exchange rate is actually 56-1, which is a 25% drop in the Russian ruble. So on the surface, it would seem the US won by points in every single round. But it's not that simple. And the real question here is a question of sensitivity. I guess in boxing terms, this would be like asking who has the better jaw, who can take more punches. So how much punches can the Russian economy take before Putin starts to feel the pressure versus how much downturn the US government can afford politically? Well, in that category, Putin is the clear winner by definition. The lack of democracy, freedom of speech, lack of freedom of press, lack of any due process, any sort of real elections, not to mention the fact that all political opposition in Russia is actually in prison. All that, unfortunately, allows Putin a much bigger buffer to absorb the US and Europe's punches. Definitely compared to the US, where the current administration is already taking a lot of heat due to inflation, gas prices, cost of living. You see, the crazy part is that for the US to win this economic warfare, it literally needs to knock out Russia, which is essentially a complete collapse of the Russian economy. That is what it takes for Putin to get rattled. So as long as Russia keeps standing, no matter how much it got beat up, it simply cannot lose, since Putin clearly gives 0% regard about the well-being of his own people and zero pressure to change that in the foreseeable future. In fact, it seems that the sanctions against Putin have strangely hurt the countries that imposed them in the first place, just as much as they hurt Russia, maybe even more. Before the war with Ukraine, Russia sold about 4 million barrels a day of crude oil to Europe, which is about 50% of its daily output. But with the war and the EU sanctions, that number dropped to 2.5 million barrels. That's a 40% drop in European consumption of Russian oil. But here's the crazy part. Though Russia is exporting fewer barrels of oil to Europe, the shortage is creating a price increase in Europe. In January this year, a barrel of crude was $60. We're now at $100 per barrel, and we even kissed $120 per barrel just for a minute there. So what happens when Russia still pushes 8 million barrels a day, but the price jumped by 70%? You guessed it right. More revenues for Russia and more expensive energy for Europe and the US. Now, according to Bloomberg, Russian oil revenues are up 50% since the start of the sanctions. That is just crazy to consider. Now, to be honest, some of this is purely self-inflicted by the US, who declared war on its own oil industry, which might have not been the smartest move in hindsight. Just ask Angela Merkel what happens when you lose energy independence. And while the US can still fight back by working with instead of against its oil industry, thereby unleashing the American oil industry into the markets, it seems that for now the policy is to keep existing policies and beg for more oil from OPEC? Until that changes, the deck is going to be stacked against the US. And that is without considering the doomsday scenario here. If Russia cuts gas supplies to Germany, for example, Germany's GDP would fall by 5% this year alone. That would be equivalent of a knockout to Germany, right there and then. So no, we're not winning the economic war. Now, while Putin seems to be safely holding on to power in Russia, things in the West are much more shaky. With less than 4 months until November's midterm elections in the US, things have really worsened for this administration. You see, according to Morning Consult Political Intelligence Survey, which was actually conducted just in this quarter, voters in 44 states actually disapprove of this administration's performance. Boris Johnson already lost his job in the UK, and things are not looking so good for the French and Italian leaders as well. And look, the last thing I want to do here is to be freaking Russian apologist. Russia was not well prepared for this. It was not prepared for the sanctions. Ask ordinary Russians how their daily life has gone to the toilet since this thing started. Putin thought Ukraine would be a walk in the park, and he got exposed hard. However, we literally bailed him out by making the surge in energy prices worse by adding oil sanctions on top of a geopolitical mess. And that is absolutely with fighting our own oil industry in the US without unleashing it to counter the effects. That is our fault. But the craziest part, there are no winners here. There are no winners in any war, including an economic attrition war like this. There are only losers. According to a recent report from the Economist Intelligence Unit, this war is going to cost all parties involved a combined of $1 trillion by the end of this year. That includes Europe, US, obviously Russia and Ukraine, Italy, Germany, France. Now just think what the world could have done with $1 trillion extra dollars. Healthcare, infrastructure, education, research and development. My goodness. Now look, I know there's going to be a lot of people in the comments saying, well, Dom, this is another proof that we're getting beat up by China. That is absolutely not correct. If you want to watch a video in which I explain why China is in deep trouble, in fact, they're collapsing, click right here. There's going to be a video about China exposing all the truth about the true China economy, not the ones you hear in mainstream media about. And also, if you haven't yet, subscribe right here for the channel. See you in the next video.